It was a crisp September morning in Ashwood, Virginia, 1975. The town was quiet, the streets lined with oak trees swaying gently in the breeze. At first glance, life here seemed almost a idyllic place where everyone knew each other, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Among the familiar faces and tidy lawns lived 17-year-old Emily Harper. Bright, cheerful, and full of promise. Emily was the kind of teenager whose laughter could fill a room and whose smile was impossible to forget. She was known in her neighborhood not just for her energy, but for her relentless curiosity and love for adventure. Emily's mornings were routine, yet charming in their simplicity. She would wake before sunrise, feed her small collection of backyard pets, and help her mother prepare breakfast for her younger siblings. School days were filled with cheer, where she excelled in literature and art, and her friends often described her as the glue that held their small circle together. Emily wasn't just a high school student. She was the heartbeat of her community, attending local fairs, volunteering at church events, and always greeting neighbors with warmth and sincerity. Her father, Emily Harper, was a carpenter known for his honesty and work ethic. Her mother, Margaret, balanced the household with patience and care, nurturing her children and keeping the family grounded. The Harpers were respected in Ashwood, a family who represented the small-town values of trust, integrity, and community. It was in this ordinary, serene environment that Emily's life seemed destined for promise, completely unaware that the world could turn on its head in an instant. That September morning, Emily set out for school, her backpack slung casually over her shoulder, unaware that she would never return the same way. For the residents of Ashwood, this day began like any other children walking to school, neighbors exchanging greetings, and the hum of a town wrapped in its comfortable routine. But for Emily Harper, this day would mark the beginning of a mystery that would baffle investigators, haunt a community, and remain unsolved for nearly 5 decades. As the sun rose higher, no one could have predicted that a single morning walk could turn into a tragedy so profound that it would echo through the lives of those who knew her. The ordinary life of Emily Harper, full of laughter, dreams, and simple pleasures, was about to be shattered forever, and Ashwood would never feel the same again. Before we dive into this chilling story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for the full investigation. The morning had barely settled over Ashwood when the first whispers of worry began to stir. Emily Harper never arrived at school. At first, her friends thought she was simply late, maybe stopped to chat along the way, as she often did. But when the bell rang and the classroom remained missing its brightest light, a ripple of unease spread through the hallways. Teachers checked roll calls again and again, but Emily's name remained unanswered. Back at home, Margaret Harper felt a familiar chill in her chest. Emily was always punctual, and she knew the routines her daughter followed like clockwork. When the front door clicked open and closed without Emily's familiar presence, panic began to creep into the Harper household. Samuel Harper rushed to the streets, scanning the familiar paths Emily would have taken, calling out her name, but only silence answered. Neighbors stepped out, drawn by the Harpers' alarm, and soon, the quiet town that prided itself on safety was wrapped in tension. By mid-morning, the local police were alerted. Officers arrived swiftly, combing the streets, checking buses, and speaking with anyone who might have seen the teenager. They retraced Emily's steps, questioning neighbors, shopkeepers, and friends. Every familiar corner of Ashwood became a scene of concern, yet no solid leads emerged. Her schoolbooks, untouched and still on the kitchen table, hinted at the suddenness of her disappearance. Her bike was found leaning against the porch, a subtle, haunting sign that Emily had left in a hurry. Orbentak in the investigation began to reveal the first cracks in the small-town veneer. Witnesses reported seeing a shadowy figure near the edge of town that morning, someone unknown, lingering where Emily often walked. But memories were fragmented, inconsistent, and hard to verify. The police documented every statement meticulously, yet each lead seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. The fear that gripped Ashwood was not just about Emily. It was about the realization that something unimaginable could happen here, in their quiet town, and no one would have noticed until it was too late. As the hours passed, search parties formed. Friends, neighbors, and family combed the surrounding woods, fields, and back roads, their voices calling Emily's name into the empty morning. Flyers were printed and posted on every lamppost, every storefront, urging anyone with information to come forward. But Emily Harper had vanished without a trace. What began as a simple morning walk had become the first chapter in a story that would puzzle law enforcement for decades. For the Harper family, each passing hour intensified the dread. Every familiar sight, a school bus, a local park, A friendly neighbor reminded them of Emily, gone, but not forgotten. And while Ashwood went about its daily life, a shadow of fear and uncertainty settled over the town. The disappearance of Emily Harper was no longer just a personal tragedy. It had become a community mystery, one that would demand answers. One that would eventually shake Ashwood to its very core. As the sun climbed higher over Ashwood, the full scope of Emily Harper's disappearance began to dawn on the local authorities. Police officers arrived at the Harper home, notebooks in hand, radios crackling with updates. Every corner of the house was examined. Emily's room meticulously searched for clues, her diary skimmed for insights, her belongings inspected for anything unusual. Yet the investigation, thorough as it seemed, quickly ran into the first of many frustrating dead ends. Detective Laura Jenkins, a seasoned officer known for her methodical approach and quiet determination, was assigned to the case. She quickly realized that solving this mystery would require more than just routine questioning. It would demand patience, instinct, and a keen eye for the overlooked. Interviews began immediately. Friends and classmates were asked to recount their last interactions with Emily. Teachers described her as bright, responsible, and well-liked, offering no motive or explanation for her sudden disappearance. Neighbors were next. Some mentioned seeing Emily walk down familiar paths that morning. Others recalled a figure lurking in the distance, someone unfamiliar and fleeting. Yet none could offer a description that pointed definitively toward a suspect. The reports were contradictory, and each new lead seemed to vanish just as quickly as it appeared. Detective Jenkins and her team noted these inconsistencies carefully, suspecting that someone in the shadows of Ashwood might have been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Meanwhile, search parties scoured the nearby woods, fields, and abandoned buildings. K9 units combed dense underbrush, their noses to the ground, ears alert for the faintest trace of Emily. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning from above as the town's residents formed human chains along creeks and trails. Every hidden path, every dark corner, every abandoned shed became a potential hiding place. Yet, despite the exhaustive efforts, Emily remained elusive, leaving the investigation mired in uncertainty. The discarded blanket, later found near the outskirts of town, would eventually become the most significant piece of evidence spot in 1975. Forensic science was limited. Technicians dusted it for fingerprints and preserved what fibers they could, but the technology of the day could not extract the secrets it held. For now, it was stored away in the evidence room, a silent witness waiting decades to speak. Detective Jenkins faced not only the challenge of finding Emily but also the frustration of a town growing restless with fear. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that Emily had run away. Others feared the worst. Parents clutched their children tighter, and every stranger on the streets drew suspicion. The Harper family's anguish was mirrored across Ashwood. The weight of uncertainty pressed down, threatening to fracture the calm exterior of the town. Despite the obstacles, Detective Jenkins remained resolute. She methodically mapped out Emily's last known movements, cross-referencing every detail, every statement, every tip received from the public. Officers followed up leads in surrounding towns, checked local bus schedules, and even investigated out-of-state sightings. Each day brought new possibilities and fresh frustrations, reinforcing a chilling reality. This case would not yield answers quickly. By the end of the first week, Ashwood had begun to understand that Emily Harper's disappearance was more than a personal tragedy. It was a mystery that might remain unsolved. But Detective Jenkins, armed with patience, determination, and a belief that no clue is ever truly lost, refused to abandon hope. Somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the truth waited. And one day, decades later, it would finally emerge. As days turned into weeks, the absence of Emily Harper cast a long, chilling shadow over Ashwood. The town that once thrived on neighborly trusts and familiar routines now felt fragile. As though every glance, every whisper, carried a secret. People started locking doors they never thought necessary, and the casual greetings on porches became hesitant nods. Fear was no longer a rumor. It had settled into the bones of the community. Local businesses reported fewer customers, not out of economic concern, but because parents refused to let their children wander freely. The school halls, once alive with laughter, were quieter. The friends of Emily glancing nervously at each other, wondering if the stranger they glimpsed that morning could still be nearby. Detective Laura Jenkins recognized that this case was no longer just a personal investigation. It had become a psychological battleground, where every member of the community was both witness and victim of the unknown. Rumors began to spiral. Some whispered that Emily had run away, enticed by a secret life in the city. Others feared something far darker. Stories of suspicious cars, strange visitors, and unfamiliar faces circulating in town multiplied like wildfire. Even innocent neighbors became subjects of scrutiny, their actions examined under a microscope of suspicion. Trust, the foundation of small-town life, was eroded. And yet, no matter how many eyes scanned the streets, Emily remained unseen. Detective Jenkins and her team held regular briefings, analyzing every tip, every sighting, every piece of potential evidence. Volunteers from the community joined the search, combing wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and creek banks. Children were instructed not to walk alone. Parents drove their teens to school, double-checking their routes. Ashwood had become a town on edge, hyper-aware that a predator or, at least an answer might, be lurking just beyond sight. Meanwhile, the media began to take notice. Local newspapers printed detailed accounts of Emily's disappearance, often emphasizing the eerie lack of clues. Headlines hinted at fear, uncertainty, and a sense of urgency that permeated the town. Residents found themselves explaining over and over the same story. Emily Harper, 17, vanished on a morning that started like any other. While the outside world observed, the people of Ashwood lived the tension firsthand, caught between hope and the gnawing dread of a mystery unsolved. At night, the streets of Ashwood were quieter than ever. Porch lights glowed longer, windows remained shut, and the familiar rhythm of the town was punctuated by the creak of a gate or the distant bark of a dog. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves became suspect, and in the Harper home, the family's grief was compounded by fear that Emily had been taken by someone they would never see coming, someone who had crossed the invisible boundary between neighborly safety and hidden danger. Detective Jenkins understood that solving this case required patience, but she also knew that time was a double-edged sword. The longer Emily remained missing, the more the town's fear would grow, and the more fragile the threads of evidence would become. Yet within this tension lay the foundation of eventual discovery. Somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the first breakthrough was waiting, perhaps a fiber on a blanket. A forgotten clue in the woods, or an unnoticed gesture, would eventually reveal what had happened that morning. Ashwood had changed. Its innocence had been replaced by vigilance, its calm replaced by anxiety. And though hope flickered faintly in the hearts of Emily's family and Detective Jenkins, one truth remained. The mystery was far from over. Every day that passed without answers deepened the shadows, making the eventual revelation of truth almost unimaginable, all the more powerful. Amid the growing tension in Ashwood, the investigation into Emily Harper's disappearance began to shift focus toward the physical evidence that had quietly waited in the shadows for decades. Among the items collected in the initial days of the search was a seemingly ordinary blanket. Its faded fabric, folded and tucked near the edge of the woods where Emily was last seen, had initially attracted little attention. In 1975, investigators had limited forensic tools, and while the blanket was carefully preserved, its true significance would not emerge for nearly half a century. Detective Laura Jenkins, reviewing the cold case files years later, understood the importance of these dormant clues. She often said, "Evidence doesn't vanish. It waits, silently, until we are ready to see it." The blanket, unremarkable to the untrained eye, held fibers and trace materials that could tell a story long before modern technology existed. Officers at the time had documented its location, photographed it, and cataloged it in the evidence room, but there was no way to extract the microscopic secrets hidden within its threads. Neighbors recalled the day it was found with vague unease. Some thought it belonged to a local family. Others wondered if it had been left by a passerby. No one associated it with Emily's disappearance. And Aubert timed the blanket was largely forgotten, quietly gathering dust in a file marked unsolved -1975. Yet in the hands of modern forensic science, it would become the key that unlocked the entire mystery. The blanket was not alone in holding secrets. Police files contained hundreds of pages of interviews, sketches, and witness statements. Each piece of information, while seemingly inconclusive, formed a mosaic of Emily's final hours. The fibers embedded in the blanket, combined with overlooked witness observations, created a trail that could now be analyzed with DNA technology, something unimaginable in the original investigation. Detective Jenkins and her team meticulously cross-referenced these records, mapping timelines, locations, and potential suspects with precision. It was during this process that a breakthrough emerged. Tiny, almost invisible fibers on the blanket matched those found on Emily's clothing that morning. While the 1975 investigation had cataloged these fibers, They had no method to link them definitively to a person. Now, with modern forensic capabilities, every thread, every hair, and every microscopic trace became a vital piece of the puzzle. Jenkins knew that this evidence was not just physical, it carried the weight of decades of unanswered questions, frustration, and grief. But for the Harper family, the notion that the blanket could hold answers was both shocking and bittersweet. It had been there all along, a silent witness to the crime, waiting for justice to catch up. Detective Jenkins emphasized that careful handling was essential. Each fiber, each DNA sample, had the potential to finally identify the person responsible for shattering Emily's life. The town, still haunted by uncertainty, began to feel a glimmer of hope, knowing that the tools of modern science could finally speak where human memory had failed. This dormant evidence, once overlooked, symbolized more than a breakthrough in forensic investigation. It represented patience, persistence, and the belief that no case is ever truly closed until every stone is turned. As the blanket was prepared for analysis with cutting-edge technology, Detective Jenkins felt the tension in her chest tighten. The clues had been waiting for nearly 50 years, and now the story they carried was ready to be told, a story that would ultimately shock the community and deliver the answers they had long yearned for. By the year 2023, the Ashwood Police Department had transformed. Modern forensic technology had advanced in ways that Detective Laura Jenkins could only have dreamed of in the 1970s. Cold cases, once resigned to dust-covered files, were now being re-examined with powerful DNA analysis and forensic genealogy tools that could finally give voice to evidence that had been silent for nearly 5 decades. Among the dormant evidence, one item stood out: the discarded blanket found near the woods on that fateful September morning. Forensic specialists began by extracting DNA traces from the fibers, a delicate process that required precision and patience. Every hair, every thread, every microscopic particle was examined under high-powered microscopes in chemical tests, designed to amplify genetic material. This was not simply science. It was a painstaking pursuit of truth, a bridge between the past and the present. Detective Jenkins watched closely, understanding that these threads could unravel a decades-old mystery. The laboratory results were subtle at first, revealing only fragments of genetic material. But when those fragments were run through modern DNA databases, the breakthrough came. A partial match to a distant relative appeared. This was the moment when decades of frustration transformed into cautious optimism. Jenkins realized that through forensic genetic genealogy, they could trace the family tree, narrowing down potential suspects who had previously been invisible to investigators. It was a painstaking process. Genealogists built out family trees, cross-referencing birth records, marriage licenses, and historical documents. Each connection brought them closer to a living suspect. For Detective Jenkins, every small discovery, an unexpected cousin, a marriage record, an old address was a piece of the puzzle that edged them nearer to Emily Harper's abductor. The patience and meticulousness of this work mirrored the quiet determination of law enforcement across the decades, a testament to their commitment to justice. As the suspect was gradually identified, the shock began to ripple through the community. The person they were closing in on was not a stranger lurking in Ashwood, but someone who had blended seamlessly into everyday life. No criminal record, no previous suspicion, just an ordinary citizen whose past would soon collide with the consequences of a nearly 50-year-old crime. Detective Jenkins understood the delicate balance. They had the evidence, but arresting someone decades later required precision, legality, and ethical vigilance. Meanwhile, Emily Harper's family learned of the breakthrough in cautious stages. The revelation that DNA could finally point to the perpetrator brought a complex mix of hope and anxiety. After years of unanswered questions, the blank space in their lives, the what, the who, the why was starting to fill. The town, too, began to sense that the mystery which had haunted them for nearly half a century might finally reach a conclusion. This forensic breakthrough was not just a scientific milestone, it was a narrative pivot. It marked the transition from decades of fear, uncertainty, and dead ends to a period of revelation, confrontation, and accountability. Detective Jenkins often reflected that evidence is memory. It waits for the right time, for the right technology, and for the right minds to uncover its story. For Ashwood, that time had arrived. The threads of a blanket, invisible to the eyes of 1975, were now the threads connecting the past to justice. And so, with DNA verified, genealogical connections established, and the suspect finally within reach. The story of Emily Harper's disappearance moved from the realm of tragedy into the hands of resolution. The next chapter would reveal the identity of the person who had haunted the town's collective conscience for nearly 5 decades, setting the stage for a confrontation that would shock Ashwood to its core. After months of meticulous genealogical work, cross-referencing records, and painstaking DNA analysis, the moment of truth finally arrived. Detective Laura Jenkins and her team had narrowed the field, identifying a suspect whose ordinary life masked an extraordinary secret. The person they were closing in on had lived in Ashwood for decades, integrated seamlessly into the community, completely unsuspected by neighbors, friends, or family. For 50 years, he had hidden in plain sight. The suspect, Daniel Mercer, a 62-year-old retired postal worker, had cultivated an image of a quiet, dependable citizen, known for volunteering at the local community center and his dedication to his garden. Mercer was the kind of man that towns like Ashwood trusted implicitly. No one could have imagined that. Beneath his veneer of normalcy lay a connection to the chilling disappearance of Emily Harper in 1975. His lack of a criminal record or suspicious behavior had kept him off law enforcement radars for decades, a ghost hiding behind the mask of respectability. Detective Jenkins reflected on the irony. Decades of investigation had overlooked the most ordinary suspect, but the blanket's DNA traces, preserved for nearly 50 years, had finally unmasked him. It was a humbling reminder that evidence has a memory far longer than human recollection, waiting for the right eyes and technology to reveal the truth. Each genealogical link, each historical record, had led inexorably to Daniel Mercer, making him the focal point of what would become the most shocking arrest in Ashwood's history. The revelation was both exhilarating and tense. Police officers coordinated quietly, preparing for the delicate task of bringing Mercer in without alerting him prematurely. They knew that he had lived undisturbed for decades, and any hint of suspicion could jeopardize the arrest and the integrity of the case. Detective Jenkins personally oversaw the operation, ensuring that every legal protocol was followed and that the evidence collected over nearly half a century would hold up in court. The community, still haunted by memories of Emily's disappearance, would soon learn that the person responsible had been one of their own. The shock was inevitable. Friends, neighbors, and even relatives of the suspect would struggle to reconcile the man. They thought they knew with the person implicated in such a harrowing crime. It was the ultimate betrayal of the ordinary citizen, the helpful neighbor, the familiar face, revealed as the architect of decades of fear and grief. For Emily Harper's family, the identification of Daniel Mercer was a seismic moment. Relief, anger, and disbelief collided in equal measure. After nearly 50 years, they finally had a name to associate with the mystery that had haunted their lives. Every unanswered question, every sleepless night, every missed milestone in Emily's life now had a face attached to it. The suspect's identification was not the end. It was the opening of a chapter that would finally allow justice to unfold. Detective Jenkins knew that naming the suspect was only the beginning. With Mercer's identity confirmed, the next steps would involve interviews, confessions, and the painstaking legal process to ensure that every piece of evidence, from the blanket to eyewitness accounts, was presented accurately and ethically. It was a careful balance between emotional satisfaction for the family and procedural rigor. And so, as the town of Ashwood braced itself, the community collectively exhaled. The mystery that had cast a shadow for nearly 5 decades now had a name. The ordinary man who had walked among them, unassuming and unnoticed, was finally identified. The next chapter would follow the dramatic arrest, the confession, and the emotional fallout that would shake Ashwood to its very core, proving that no secret can remain hidden forever. The quiet streets of Ashwood would never be the same. Early one morning, Detective Laura Jenkins and a team of carefully selected officers moved in. Every step of the operation had been planned with precision. Daniel Mercer, the man who had lived in the town for decades without suspicion, was about to face the consequences of a crime that had haunted the community for nearly 50 years. The air was thick with anticipation, tension radiating from every officer as they approached his home. Mercer's house, a modest, well-kept property near the edge of town, had long been a symbol of normalcy. Neighbors often remarked on his dedication to gardening, his quiet demeanor, and his willingness to lend a hand. No one could have predicted that behind this facade lay the person responsible for Emily Harper's disappearance. As officers surrounded the house, Detective Jenkins reminded her team, "Stay calm, follow procedure, and remember this, as the culmination of decades of painstaking investigation. The moment of entry was swift and controlled. Officers knocked firmly, announcing their presence, and Mercer answered with the same polite demeanor that had masked his secret life for decades. There was no immediate recognition of the charges that awaited him. The handcuffs clicked into place, and in that instant, a decades-old mystery finally took a tangible, human form. Mercer, once an ordinary citizen walking among friends and neighbors, was now a suspect in custody, his ordinary life fractured in the blink of an eye. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. News traveled quickly. The man they had trusted, the neighbor they had smiled at, the friend who had offered small acts of kindness, all were suddenly cast in a horrifying new light. Ashwood residents struggled to reconcile the image of Daniel Mercer, the seemingly benign figure, with the revelation that he had been hiding a dark secret for nearly half a century. Conversations stopped abruptly in grocery stores. Eyes flicked nervously down streets, and parents held their children tighter. For Emily Harper's family, the arrest was both cathartic and surreal. Relief mingled with decades of sorrow and anger. Every unanswered question, every missed milestone, every lost moment in Emily's life now had a path toward closure. Margaret Harper, Emily's mother, stood silently as officers confirmed the arrest. A mixture of grief and vindication etched across her face. Samuel Harper, stoic but shaken, understood that justice had finally begun to take shape. Detective Jenkins reflected on the operation as Mercer was escorted from his home. It was the culmination of years of methodical investigation, patience, and relentless pursuit of truth. The discarded blanket, once ignored, had finally delivered the critical evidence, linking Mercer to Emily's disappearance. Each fiber, each trace, had endured the decades, bearing witness to the crime until modern technology could reveal the story it held.
As Mercer was led to the waiting police vehicle, questions loomed. How could a man live among friends and family, unsuspected, for so long? How did the community fail to see the signs, however subtle? These questions would dominate conversation for months, perhaps years. The arrest was not just a procedural victory, it was a moment that shattered assumptions, exposed hidden truths, and reaffirmed the persistence of justice. The streets of Ashwood, once quiet and seemingly ordinary, now carried the weight of decades-old fear and revelation. The arrest of Daniel Mercer was the turning point in a case that had left the town in suspense for nearly 50 years. Detective Jenkins knew that this was only the beginning. The legal process, confessions, and trial would follow, but for now, the first step had been taken. The shadow that had haunted Ashwood for generations was finally confronted. Inside the Ashwood Police Department, the interrogation room was quiet, almost eerily so. Detective Laura Jenkins sat across from Daniel Mercer, the man who had haunted the town's collective conscience for nearly 50 years. The air was heavy with anticipation, and even the faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to carry the weight of decades-long mystery. Mercer, once the embodiment of ordinary life, now sat exposed under the stark reality of evidence and accountability. Detective Jenkins opened the session with a calm, measured tone. Daniel, we have the evidence. The blanket, the fibers, the DNA, they all point to you. Emily Harper's disappearance is not a story we will let fade into history. It's time to tell the truth. Mercer, initially silent, studied the walls, the ceiling, and finally Jenkins herself, as if measuring the decades he had spent hiding against the inevitability of discovery. Minutes passed like hours. Then, almost imperceptibly, Mercer shifted. The quiet of the room broke with a single, reluctant admission. He had been near the woods that morning in September 1975, the day Emily Harper vanished. His voice, at first tentative, grew firmer as the weight of years pressed on him. Every carefully constructed alibi, every day of normalcy, was now meaningless. He could not escape the threads of evidence, the blanket, the fibers, the DNA, that had finally caught up to him. As Mercer spoke, Detective Jenkins allowed the confession to unfold without interruption, understanding that the man's words were both the final piece of the puzzle and the bridge to closure. He described the encounter with Emily, the circumstances that had led to her disappearance, and, in moments that were almost unbearable to hear, the mistakes and impulses that had spiraled out of control. Each revelation confirmed what the evidence had long suggested, yet the human dimension, the fear, the panic, the irrevocable choices, brought the horror of that day into sharp, vivid focus. For the Harper family, the confession was devastating but necessary. Margaret Harper listened, tears streaking her face, as decades of uncertainty crystallized into painful clarity. Samuel Harper's jaw tightened, grief mingling with relief, knowing that Emily's story would no longer exist as a mystery. Every question that had lingered, every what if that had haunted their lives, now had answers. The confession, though grim, finally provided the closure they had waited for since that fateful morning. Detective Jenkins carefully documented each detail, ensuring that the confession aligned with the physical evidence collected from the blanket, the fibers, and eyewitness accounts. The meticulous work of decades was now validated. Every step, from the original investigation to the modern forensic breakthrough, had converged in this moment, proving the endurance of evidence, the power of persistence, and the inevitability of truth. As the room emptied, and Mercer was escorted to holding cells in preparation for trial, a quiet sense of resolution settled over the police department. The case that had once seemed unsolvable had been unraveled, stitch by stitch, thread by thread. For Ashwood, the revelation of truth transformed fear into understanding, suspicion into clarity, and decades of anxiety into the beginnings of healing. Detective Jenkins reflected on the journey. The confession was more than legal confirmation, it was a narrative closure, a story completed. Justice, delayed for nearly 50 years, had finally arrived. And while the pain of Emily Harper's disappearance would never vanish entirely, the truth illuminated the path forward. A community could heal, a family could grieve with certainty, and a decades-old shadow could finally be brought into the light. The courtroom in Ashwood buzzed with a tension that had been building for nearly 50 years. Residents, journalists, and family members filled every seat, their faces etched with anticipation and lingering fear. The trial of Daniel Mercer, the man who had lived among them for decades as a trusted neighbor, was about to bring closure to a story that had haunted the town since the fall morning of 1975. Detective Laura Jenkins observed from the back of the room, her notes and files neatly arranged on the bench before her. The evidence, painstakingly collected over decades, was now being presented with clarity and precision. The discarded blanket, the trace fibers, the DNA evidence, and Mercer's confession formed a coherent narrative that left little room for doubt. Each piece was a testament to patience, persistence, and the enduring power of forensic science. Emily Harper's family sat in the front row, bracing themselves as the prosecution laid out the timeline of events. Margaret Harper clutched her hands tightly, her knuckles white, while Samuel Harper's gaze remained steady, absorbing every detail. For them, the trial was both painful and necessary, a public acknowledgement of the truth that had remained hidden for far too long. The emotional weight of decades of uncertainty was finally being confronted head-on. Mercer's defense tried to challenge the evidence, questioning the integrity of decades-old items and the methods used in modern DNA analysis. But each argument was systematically dismantled. Detective Jenkins testified with quiet authority, explaining the chain of custody, the forensic breakthroughs, and the corroborating eyewitness statements. The courtroom listened, rapt, as the story of Emily Harper's disappearance unfolded, not as rumor or speculation, but as a meticulously documented narrative backed by science and human investigation. When the verdict was finally read, silence fell over the room. Guilty on all counts. The words reverberated through Ashwood like a seismic shift. For the Harper family, relief and sorrow mingled in equal measure. Justice had been delivered, not swiftly, but with the weight of certainty that only decades of effort could produce. Mercer, once a symbol of ordinary life, would now serve as a reminder that even the most carefully constructed facades cannot escape accountability. The community's reaction was profound. Conversations that had once been dominated by suspicion and fear were now tempered with reflection and understanding. Residents began to discuss the importance of vigilance, of noticing subtle signs, and of supporting law enforcement in uncovering the truth. The town, scarred by decades of uncertainty, started the slow process of healing, recognizing that closure was not just legal, it was communal. For Detective Jenkins, the trial was more than a professional triumph. It was a personal victory for her team, for the family, and for the principles of justice itself. Years of dedication, meticulous review of old files, and innovative forensic analysis had culminated in this moment. She reflected on the journey, from the initial disappearance, the dormant evidence, the painstaking genealogical work, to the eventual confession and courtroom victory. Each chapter had required patience, courage, and an unwavering commitment to truth. As Ashwood emerged from the shadow of the case, the story of Emily Harper served as a lasting reminder. No crime, however carefully concealed, remains hidden forever. The collective effort of investigators, forensic specialists, and a vigilant community had brought light to decades of darkness. Emily Harper's name, once associated with fear and uncertainty, was now tied to resilience, persistence, and the eventual triumph of justice. The courtroom emptied, leaving behind the echoes of a story finally concluded. Detective Jenkins stepped outside, inhaling the crisp air, and looked across the town that had endured so much. For Ashwood, the shadow had lifted. The legacy of fear had been replaced with understanding, the void of unanswered questions filled with truth. Justice, delayed but finally delivered, had reaffirmed the town's faith in persistence, evidence, and the unwavering human pursuit of accountability.